Greenberg! Mr. Greenberg!
Why, hello there, student me.
I'm trying to improve my score on the SAT, but my vocabulary is super weak. Do you have any tips that can help me boost my vocab?
Well, for starters, have you checked out my video on vocab in context questions? It gives you 3 simple steps that you can use to solve these questions, even when you don't know all of the words.
Yeah, I saw that one, and it was pretty helpful, but honestly, I think I just need to learn more words.
I hear you, student me. You see, sometimes you can work around unfamiliar vocab, but sometimes you just gotta know the words. Certainly, if you want to earn the kind of score that's going to get you into the Ivy League or a T20 school, you're going to need a large vocabulary. And developing a large vocabulary can be difficult. English is one of the largest languages in the world, with 1 million words by some counts. But the good news is that you don't need to know all of those words. In fact, the average adult native speaker only knows about 40,000. Still, in general, the more words you do know, the better your chances of earning a high score on the test.
No offense, Mr. Greenberg, but that's kind of obvious. I know I need to improve my vocab, I just don't know how.
Well, don't you worry, student me, because in this video, I'm going to help answer that question. We're going to discuss 4 common methods of vocab acquisition and weigh the advantages and disadvantages of each. Then, I'll share my own thoughts on what I think is the best vocab acquisition strategy for improving vocab in a way that will actually boost your score on the SAT. So be sure to stick around until the end. Hello, I'm Nathan Greenberg, founder of Ivy League Mentors, and today we're going to discuss vocab acquisition strategies. Now, the first strategy is one I like to call brute force. Now, I've taught at a lot of academies over my 15 years teaching SAT, and they all use this method. Basically, they'll give students a list of 50 or 100 or 150 words in the morning, and in the afternoon, they'll test the students on those words. And if they don't get a certain percentage right, they'll make them restudy and take it again. And typically, they won't be allowed to go home until they pass the test. And they do this day after day after day, sometimes for an entire summer break.
Mr. Greenberg, that sounds absolutely miserable.
No, student me, it certainly isn't fun. But if you can force yourself to do this, your vocabulary will improve, and you will probably earn a higher score on the test as a result. That said, there are some serious downsides to the brute force method. One is that it's highly dependent on the quality of the vocab list that you're using. You see, not all words are equally likely to come up on the test. There are some words that are very likely to come up on the test, and there are some words that will almost certainly not come up on the test. And if the vocab list that you're using include a lot of words that are highly unlikely to come up on the test, you're basically wasting your time by learning them. Another problem is that if you learn a lot of words rapidly like that, you may remember them the next day, but you're unlikely to remember them in the long term unless you take active steps to reinforce your long-term memory. So in short, the brute force method can yield great results if you have the discipline for it, especially if you're working with high-quality vocab lists and focus on long-term rather than short-term memorization. That said, it's pretty miserable, and it's probably not the most efficient method for improving your vocab in a way that's actually going to translate into a higher score on the test.
So what is the most efficient method?
So another option is to learn from the tests themselves. This is actually something that I encourage my students to do all the time. Whenever they get a question wrong because they didn't know a particular word, I have them add that word to something I call the Fool Me Twice list. The name comes from the old expression, fool me once, shame on you, but fool me twice, shame on me. Basically, if you get a question wrong on the SAT because you didn't know a particular word, that's not your fault. We all have limitations. But if you get another question wrong on another practice test, or even worse, on the real test because you didn't know that same word, that's 100% on you. So by keeping track of the words that fool you on the practice tests, you can learn them and make sure that they won't fool you again. Plus, if you follow this method, you can be confident that the words you're learning are the kinds of words that really appear on the test. Because they really appeared on the test.
That makes total sense. But then do I even need to mess around with any of the other methods?
Well, unfortunately, learning from the test does have some drawbacks. The biggest is that you're probably not going to learn a lot of words that way. You see, you can take 10 practice tests and maybe you'll get 10 or 15 words to add to your Fool Me Twice list from each of those tests. But that's still just 150 to 200 words. Now that's a great start, but if you want to see a big jump in your score, you're probably going to need to learn a lot more than that. Keep in mind that the chance of any one individual word appearing on a given test is very low.
So what else can I do?
Well, a third common approach is to learn word roots.
What's a word root?
Word roots are the basic linguistic units from which words are formed. Once you learn to recognize these word roots, you'll see them everywhere. So the basic idea is that by learning just one common word root, you might be able to unlock the meaning of dozens of actual words. Take a root like cred, for example. Now this root comes from the Latin for trust or believe. And if you know that, it's easy to remember that a word like credible means trustable or believable, or to see that a word like incredulity means the inability to trust or believe, or to know that a word like discredit means to erode trust or believability.
That's totally cool. So can I just memorize word roots, or does this approach have downsides also?
Well, to be honest, the biggest downside is that it's not always easy to predict the meaning of a word from the roots alone. Roots do allow you to make an educated guess, but at the end of the day, you're still guessing, which isn't ideal.
So then what about the final method?
So the last method is what I call the organic approach. Basically, you just read a lot. And the idea is if you do that, your vocab will naturally improve. And you might even have fun in the process.
Can I read whatever I want, or does it have to be really boring stuff?
I don't know. What do you mean by boring?
You know, like the kind of books they make you read in school. Like last semester, my teacher assigned The Great Gatsby, and man, I hated that book.
Oh, student me, you and I both know that you gave up after the first chapter of that book and just read the Spark Notes.
What else was I supposed to do? It was so hard.
I get it, and that's a valid point. You see, if you're trying to get through a 400-page novel and you have to look up a word every sentence, it's going to get really tedious really fast, and you're probably going to want to give up. So for this technique to work, what you really need to do is to pick something level appropriate, and that involves balance. You see, the goal is to improve your vocab, so you want something that's going to have at least some words that you don't really know. But at the same time, you don't want something that's going to be sending you running to the dictionary every couple of minutes. And beyond that, it doesn't really matter what you read, so try to pick content that interests you. In fact, I would even say that you don't necessarily have to read it all. I've seen students who've been able to achieve similar results just from listening to a bunch of podcasts or watching documentaries. Anything that will expose you to new vocab.
I got it, Mr. Greenberg. So you're saying I can just watch some documentaries on Netflix and I never have to bother messing around with any vocab lists or roots or any of those other approaches.
Well, not so fast. You see, the organic approach is a pretty slow way of acquiring vocab. The students I've met who have the biggest vocabularies tend to be ones who've been regular readers for years. But if your SAT is next month, simply reading a lot is probably not going to boost your vocabulary in a meaningful way.
That's tough. It really seems like all of these methods have both pros and cons. So which one would you personally recommend?
Well, the method that I would personally recommend is actually kind of a mix of the 4 different methods that we've discussed, and I feel it draws from the best of each of them. Start by taking practice tests and learning from them. Keep in mind that you don't necessarily need to learn every word you don't know on a practice test because some of the words don't matter. But if there's a word that you don't know that causes you to get a question wrong, that word did matter, and you certainly want to learn it so that it doesn't fool you again. Next, you're probably going to want to spend some time with vocab lists. If you want a good list to start with, I will leave a link to my own vocab list, Essential Vocab for the Digital SAT, in the comments. But you can find plenty of other vocab lists online. One thing to keep in mind is just because a vocab list has 1,000 words doesn't necessarily mean that you need to learn all 1,000 words. Feel free to be selective. On any vocab list, there are going to be some words that you know you've heard a bunch, but you still don't really remember. And there's also going to be words that you say, is this even English? I would recommend focusing on the first category because those are the words that you know are likely to come up again. Also, rather than memorizing definitions, I would encourage you to memorize vocab through memorizing key sentences that illustrate their meaning. Now I know that sounds a little bit strange, but it's actually a lot easier to remember a sentence, especially if it's an interesting one, than a definition. Also, the SAT will often give you several words that have very similar meanings, and if you memorize a sentence, you're going to know how that word is typically used, so you will be much better at understanding which context make that word an appropriate choice. So plug those words and sample sentences into an app like Quizlet, and try to spend at least a few minutes with it every day. And if you can tolerate it, more. Next, I would recommend trying to learn some word roots. Now, you don't have to go overboard with this one, but if you can master the most common 30 or 50 word roots, it will dramatically increase your ability to guess around unfamiliar vocab on the test. And that's important because no matter how good your vocabulary is, you probably are going to see at least a few words that you don't know when you're taking the real SAT. I made a list of those too, and I'll leave the link in the comments as well. Finally, I would encourage you to read, listen to, or watch as much as possible, but make sure that what you are reading, listening to, or watching is level appropriate. And if you don't enjoy it, don't feel like you need to do this one. Look, ultimately, developing a good vocabulary is something that takes a lot of time and effort, and anybody who tells you otherwise is lying to you. But I do believe that if you follow the steps in this video, you will maximize your growth in the least painful way possible. Thanks for watching, and if you have any tricks for improving vocab that I haven't mentioned, feel free to share them in the comments. Good luck on the test.